as I was saying, all joking aside. So now we go back to where we left off. Some of you know this, many of you have inklings of it, some of you don't know this at all, so I'm going to briefly summarize. We left off the Civil War, the separating of the British East Indies Company position in maintaining the rights and the commercial interests of the Crown into the two separations, the Virginia Land Company, the line of the land, the king, and the line of the law. So New York City was destined to be and was always designed to be the seat of the empire, the seat of the basis of law, the seat of the bonding structure of the monetary system. And so hence that separating to the northern aspect of it, the line of the priests, the control of the law, to the Hudson Bay Company. One of the things, very briefly, that I'll mention that this entails is the moving of what's called the law of the sea onto the land, okay, Admiralty Law. In Admiralty Law, the admiral is the unilateral authority. Nothing supersedes the admiral's law. It has to be that way. When you're on the sea, of course, when he commissions a captain of a ship, then the captain carries the admiral's authority on that ship. You have to have it that way, otherwise you get what? The mutiny on the Bounty. Of course, you know, it's at a certain point when the overburden of the authorities dictates becomes abusive to those that are under it, we do have the right to reestablish our own authority, hence a mutiny. But by and large, the law of the sea is he who is in control of the ship is absolute in authority. Okay, you can't have two captains on a ship. You know, one says go left, one says go right, and the wave says, you know, one of you is wrong. You know, now the captain may be wrong too, but you know, you have to follow one authority. So the control of the vessel and the laws of admiralty are key amongst the laws of nations, but they belong to the law of the sea, and they belong to the laws of international relationships amongst the law of nations. They do not belong to the law of the land. The law of the land belongs to the people. And there's a long history of that, starting with the Magna Carta, which came out in 1215, which of course was signed by our friend King John, who 2 years previously just signed over, you know, his titles, lands, and herediments. So of course the Pope immediately said, after he signed the Magna Carta, you don't have the authority to do that, and said, you know, we're negating that. Later, a different Pope confirmed the validity of the Magna Carta. I think it was 1297, and I don't know the name of the Pope, but and I'm not quite sure of the Latin exactly, but it's something like Cartum Confirmatum, something like that, confirming the letter or confirming the Carta, the Magna Carta. And that's the basis of the law of the land. And it established the relationship between the nobles who had a co-relationship to the land with the law of the king, who was the sovereign and absolute. That relationship was and is the fact that in the feudal system, the king, as the absolute sovereign and the controller of the land, has the authority to grant land to his noblemen. And the basis of that is a contract. The contract is what's called an oath of fealty. An oath of fealty is an oath of loyalty. That's the reciprocation of the receipt of that grant of land. The loyalty is to the king. The loyalty is to deliver taxation, arms, warriors, men, etc., to support the realm and support the king. There has to be that bond of loyalty. As long as that bond of loyalty exists, then the grant of the lordship to holding the land is established and irrevocable. So there's where we get landlord, because the ultimate lord is the king, who says that he has authority under his crown or his coronation, which is putting the corona of the sun, which is controlled by the Sun King, or the vicar of Christ, the pontiff, who is the bridge to heaven, who is the Anunnaki, the bridge between Ki, earth, and Na, the bridge, Anu being heaven. And so that reinterpretation that there are Anunnaki, who are these guys who came down from Nibiru, is just this overlay for justifying, okay, this is how we're going to vest complete and absolute authority into the king and the priest, because the vicar can establish both the line of the king and the priest. He controls the priesthood, which will eventually become secularized, as I have said, to the priests of the temple, the priests of the temple bar, the priests of the temples of justice wearing the black robes. So the the relationship between the oath of fealty between the two high contracting parties, the sovereign and the land grant recipients, is established, and therefore the extension of the control of the land goes to the peerage, which are those noblemen, etc., who hold the land. So the Magna Carta established, among other things, the right of a trial by jury of one's peers. Okay, where does that word peers come from? It comes from peerage. Peerage means lineage and nobility. So it's established there. So when the Constitution for the United States of America and then the Bill of Rights established the unalienable right in the Fourteenth Amendment to a trial by jury, anything over any controversy above $20, and that would be $20 of silver, real substance, money, specie, as provided for in the Constitution, then that meant that the law of the sovereign, and the sovereign is the people are the sovereign. Once the Constitution was established, even though it had this attachment to the crown through what I described earlier, it's still established that the people at that time, the white males who were landholders, who were qualified electors, which basically meant that they were the equivalent of a prince of the realm. So the white male qualified elector landholder was of the peerage. Therefore, the Seventh Amendment provided for the right, the unalienable, irrevocable right to a trial by jury. A jury of his peers meant the peerage, which established we were equal to and held the law and the land as a sovereign. Because in common law, when an individual brings an action in law, you are the highest authority of law. You are equal to the king. You are the king, and you establish your court. So, and the defendant, who is also considered to be equal to you, is provided a right of a trial by jury of his peers, so that it balances out the law of the king. And basically you have your basic constellation of the 13th component, the king or the sovereign, in the middle of a constellation of 12 houses, as in the houses of the zodiac. So to balance the plaintiff and the defendant. So that's how law works. That's the law of the land. If you remember from our history classes in high school, which did tell us a few pieces of truth in amongst all the propaganda, but if you remember, boy, that's funny. I just forgot what I was trying to tell you to remember. Oh no, now I remember it. Now that I've remembered, if you will remember, it was discussed that one of the key issues of the Revolutionary War was that the king had established what was called Vice Admiralty courts. Anybody remember that? Not one of you remember that.
Oh, I think they barely touched on it.
Okay. Well, they did. Go dig out your 11th grade U.S. history book, which I'm sure you all kept, right? Okay, let me refresh your memory. That was one of the issues, the establishment by the king of Vice Admiralty courts. What that means is that each governor of each colony was also made a vice admiral, which meant that he had admiralty jurisdiction. And he established Vice Admiralty courts, which basically brought the law of the sea into the colonies, which when I said the admiral has absolute authority, so a vice admiral has the same thing. And what it does is it establishes the function of the vessel or the ship in admiralty. And here in this case, back then in the 1770s, the governor of the colony was an admiral or a vice admiral with the same authority. So when somebody was brought into a court of vice admiralty, the law of the land did not apply. Okay, so in reviewing law in its basic structure, you have law, which is the law of the land based on sovereignty and capacity. You have what's called equity. Equity is the law of the contract, basically. Ultimately, contract is the highest form of law, because if I enter into a contract with Barbara, we establish our private law, okay, whatever the law of the contract is. Now, if we also in that contract establish a jurisdiction, and we say the jurisdiction of this contract is the corporate state of California, then we've invited the state of California in as a party to the contract in which that contract and that law will be adjudicated if there's an issue. Okay? So there are two terms also that are important in law: jurisdiction and venue. Venue is established by the people who are on the land in the local venue or local structure coming together. In the case of what we have now done in re-inhabiting the Republic, we have created local assemblies and local county settlements. So venue is established by where the jury is derived from or pulled from. So in other words, if we're operating in law and we pull the jury from those on the land in sovereign capacity in the Republic, then that establishes venue. And if we are also, by contract or otherwise, in the jurisdiction of the Republic of California versus the state of California as a capital letter, all capital letter corporate entity, that's where our jurisdiction is. So back to equity. Equity is the law of the contract. Then we have admiralty. Admiralty is the law of the sea, as I described. So the Revolution, among other things, expelled the concept of the Vice Admiralty courts. Well, the bankers and the Sabbatean trust of the 13 families and otherwise those to fulfill the template we've been talking about, it was their imperative that they bring the law of the sea back over the land and basically create a mirror reflection of reality. Everything you're dealing with, and when I say reality, let's just say the relative reality of how we are existing on this planet with law, land, and so forth. Because there's a deeper reality, we'll talk about that later in the afternoon. Okay, but so the mirror reflection is that we think we're in one area of reality and we're actually in another. So the magicians of the temples of justice are in their own secret society, playing the game of legal construction and operating in many ways to their advantage. And Now, this is not a class to go into extensive law and all of that. If this is of interest, true interest for you, and you want to understand what we're really doing in the Republic and understand how we have the capacity to return to the law of the land and truly have capacity to be self-directive in terms of law and land and so forth, and remove ourselves from the venue and jurisdiction of a master corporation. Yeah, we will get into that too. That's another, well, I'm only touching on it. What I'm saying is if that is of interest to you, then come on aboard and join the Republic and start learning, okay? Because that is part of the solution. That is a sort of socio-economic political solution. Okay. Later, I'll give you, for lack of a better term, the multidimensional spiritual solution. Great. Okay? Yes. But we're talking about socio-economic political structure now. But the key is, how do we remove the people from a sovereign capacity and put them back into a slave capacity under feudal serfdom, lord and vassal relationship? Because that's what basically the corporate statutory public system is. It's a feudal system. The serfs are lifted off the land. We are landless peasants. We do not own land. And we are under the dictates of the Lord of the Manor. Who is the Lord of the Manor? Well, just like in the nobility who sat on the top of the hill, the highest vantage point in any given location, where did they build the castles? And where was the Lord of the Manor? The landlord who controlled everything, and everybody was underneath at the highest point. We'll go to every city on this planet. What's the highest building? They're the banks, okay? Go to San Francisco. It's the Bank of America and the Transamerica building, you know. Transamerica building, which is shaped like a very large conical shape, like the Shem Mana, that conical shape of the mana that we talked about yesterday. But isn't that the case? In every city, big and small, the Lord of the Manor overlording all of the serfs who are landless peasants are the banks, right? Any objection to that?
No,
I mean, yes, we have.
Way up, all the biggest buildings were there.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I have an objection to that fact, yes, but no objection to the fact that it is a fact. Okay. So how did that get turned around? Well, again, we're only touching on it to frame it out. This is an ongoing matter of continuing education. So I'm giving you the framework and the pathway for you to continue, if you're interested, your education to understand this. And understand that all we are really doing in this equity system is, like we said earlier, giving the ability to become the servants of and the stewards of the royal estate that controls the land. Well, how did that happen? Well, we have the separation to north and south, as I described, Hudson Bay Company into the Empire State that will eventually hold the the Federal Reserve System. And the other thing is that we don't have the map now, but I'm sure you can think up in your mind that if we go from New York and we go through the Great Lakes and the canal, the Erie Canal and the waterways, it leads over to Lake Michigan, which touches upon the shore of Chicago. And in Chicago, so following the waterways, through the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes, the canal, and et cetera, down to the shoreline of Chicago, there's this little place called Metro. Anybody here know Metro? Heard of Metro? It's called Metro, and it's at 1313 60th Street. They like those double numbers, 1313 60th Street. Just do a Google search on Metro 1313 60th Street. Okay, what is Metro? Metro is the place where all uniform acts that are distributed to all corporate states are generated. What are uniform acts? Uniform Identity Acts, Uniform Communication Acts, Uniform Commercial Code, all the codifications that we're attached to when we bind ourselves by venue and jurisdiction to the corporate state. What is a corporate state? It's the United States that converted itself to a corporation, and I'm going to explain that in a moment, and eventually that corporation was put into bankruptcy. In bankruptcy, which is in Admiralty, we all became vessels upon the sea, okay, and under the rules of Admiralty, as I just described. So the law of the priests, ultimately, in its final expression, locking us in, is the Uniform Commercial Code, promulgated and distributed by Metro and a couple other things that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So,
Is that attached to the 7,000 business code?
well, it's attached to all codes, okay? All codes and all statutes. Every state has what's called revised statutes or some variation on that expression. Revised statutes, go to your law library. Don't just do it electronically. Get a physical book of revised statutes, California revised statutes, Nevada revised statutes, and open it up. And just like any page, any book on the first frontis page, you have several things: the publisher, facts about the publication, and who holds the copyright. Well, who holds the copyright is this company called West Publishing. Who owns West Publishing? The Crown of England, okay? There's this thing called the Companies Registry in England that it's very interesting. You can look up, for example, and that's in England, in Britain, these are all the Crown and the English companies that are registered. And again, when you register as a corporation, you are incorporating under the one master corporation, which is under the Crown in the City of London. The City of London is called the corporation. So there's only one corporation in the world, Everything else is a corporate subdivision. So if you look up company registries, you'll find things like United States of America Limited. That's a corporation under the British Companies Registry. You will find In God We Trust Limited. That's a corporation. So everybody who thinks that they're pledging allegiance to God or flag or country and proud that it says In God We Trust doesn't know that that's a British corporation held by the Crown. Yeah. Now you can look under Dun and Bradstreet, which is corporate registry. It's an international corporate registry for relative credit worthiness. There's something like 186,000, 147,000, a lot of thousands of companies that are all government, United States government companies. They're all corporations. Everything is a corporation. Now I'll tell you how we got there. Remember, the United States was a foreign entity to the republics of the several states, the free and independent states, with a claim as the creditor from the Crown, as I explained earlier. So what we want to do, we being those who want to create this master template, is convert that federal entity from that limited jurisdiction to cover and blanket all the jurisdictions, and bring everybody in under it and attach them by bonding and suretyship and contract. So the way that was done is we have the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, we passed something called the 14th Amendment. First of all, there was the new 13th Amendment. The original one, the titles of nobility, was hidden away and suppressed. So we have the Proclamation of, Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves. But the slaves are not going to be allowed to be sovereigns. They're not going to be allowed to come onto the land. So they have to be given a new status of citizenship. So the 14th Amendment established that class of citizen, a U.S. citizen. Prior to that, the qualified electors, a man on the land, was not a U.S. citizen. He was a citizen of his free republic. Okay, he wasn't a citizen. He was a qualified elector standing on the land. Okay, because you can't be a sovereign and a citizen at the same time. It's it's what is it? It's an oxymoron. They don't fit. So now when 60 Minutes is vilifying the sovereign citizens, of course most of the public says, oh yeah, those nasty sovereign citizens. They don't exist. You can't be both at the same time. But if we can move or start creating a methodology to move the sovereigns into citizen class, then they can become bonded slaves. Does that make sense?
No.
Well, it doesn't make sense to us, but it makes sense to bankers, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you have to, what I'm trying to give you is a lineage of the logic under their extrapolation of law or legalistic smoke and mirrors. This is what they operate on.
Smoke and mirrors.
Okay.
Another way I explain it is there's no one above the sovereign.
Right.
Essentially, it was under God, under
Right.
the Creator. But the U.S. citizen, the corporate citizen, the 14th Amendment slave, is under the U.S. corporation. And he gets his rights and privileges from the U.S. corporation.
And see, in 1866, the first Civil Rights Act was passed. We normally, having grown up in the last 50, 60 years or so, remember all the civil rights stuff in the 60s, thinking that was the Civil Rights Act. Well, that was only one of numerous ones. The first one was 1866, which was the first step in creating that containment field to move us all into the civitas, the civil body, as the containment field in which we accept civil rights, which are granted privileges under contract. And see, we accept benefits. We accept benefits of Medi-Cal, Medicaid, Social Security, and all the rest of it, the gazillions of entitlements and so forth. So if you accept a benefit and a privilege, you also have to accept the commensurate burden of that. Okay, so remember how Lincoln was assassinated and then Andrew Johnson became president, and then he was the first president who was going to be impeached. The reason was he was fighting against the Civil Rights Bill, and he didn't want it to pass because he saw that it was going to consolidate too much power into the United States, into the federal government. And basically Lincoln was a mixed character. He destroyed the Constitution in order to save it. He believed in his political history in more centralization of government. So he was moving towards that. He was a good figure to play that role. And he totally suspended the Constitution, declared martial law, and many other elements that took place in 1860, 61 through the war. But then he was going to try and move it back. And of course, he couldn't be allowed to do that. So following the Civil War and his assassination, and then the passage of the 1866 Civil Rights Act, was the Reconstruction Acts, which basically continued the relationship of the federal entity, the United States, as a conqueror, foreign nation conqueror of the southern states. The southern states were brought back into a corporate union, not a sovereign constitutional union, under conquest, which is the rules of war, conquest, and booty. You know what booty is? Not the thing that not the thing you shake. It's bootylicious. In your world, of course it is, but no, is the the spoils of war. To the conqueror can to take his booty, his prize. That's what they did often, or not often, always, in paid mercenaries in war, that once they conquered their objective, they were allowed to, rape and pillage and take their booty. Okay, in two forms. Maybe that's where bootylicious comes from. How was your night, George? I was bootylicious. What'd you get? Well, I got, okay. So all this was being set up in the post-Civil War. So the southern states came in as conquered nations, And the slaves had to be put into a citizen class. So the 14th Amendment established a class of United States citizen, and you should read that amendment many times over, and it talks about, or it states how, any person. Now, what is a person? There was already movement towards establishing the definition of person as a corporation. What is a corporation? A corporation is something that is artificial or a fiction in law that operates under limited liability. In 1851, there was a passage of the Limited Liability Act. What is limited liability? It means that an individual man or woman, a living man or woman, can act as a officer, agent, representative, and so forth by being bonded for risk under things like errors and omissions and risk insurance with limited liability. He does not have full commercial liability. So he can take a corporation and, whichever one it was, Merck or Pfizer, invent Vioxx, for example, that they know volitionally and with full knowledge that it's going to kill so many people because their tests have proven it's going to kill so many people, but they do all these calculations. Okay, well, it costs us, $1 billion to develop, and we can make $20 billion in gross revenue, and it'll kill so many people, and it will cost us $4 billion to get rid of the lawsuits. That's 4 plus 1, 5. We made 20, 15 profit. Good deal, So that's just collateral damage, and then they can, justify with what I talked about earlier, the Kol Nidra and, the Sabbatean mandates and all the rest of that. So the individuals have limited liability. They're protected behind a bond, a risk bond. Okay, so this is why corporatism is the ultimate structure. And basically, if you study the nature of, or the truth about fascism, Mussolini said it. Fascism and corporatism are indistinguishable from each other. They are one and the same thing.
Andrew Jackson was almost assassinated, I believe, by the histories, right, 3 times because he did not want the banking system to be a corporate structure. And do you think if he would have got his way instead of Lincoln getting it passed to make the banking system corporate, would have won the war because of the liability of the states against the government of the United States?
You mean the Civil War?
Yeah,
well,
bankers
but
were responsible for what they started, just like cigarette companies responsible for the tobacco they sell.
Right.
Not hiding behind an entity, an invisible entity. This is what I understood. Andrew Jackson was such a controversial piece, and not that he did everything right, but he did pound this away that he did not want banks to be.
Well, but he won. He stopped the rechartering or renewal of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. So it was stopped in 1836. So between 1836 and into the 1900s, there was no central bank. So, we could debate all kinds of historical what-ifs. If this had happened, that happened.
I thought that would have changed it if he did.
Well, probably.
As protection.
Yeah, but the thing is that, what I'm saying is, we could discuss and debate that, but let's not do that today. The point is, this is how history did unfold. And like I said earlier, you have to look at the progression of law as a parallel path. The progressive incremental implementing of the system that they have structured today, and then the underlying placement of key laws that we can stand on to protect us. Now, well, let me not go there yet. So the bottom line is that all these things are falling into place. In 1868, we have the 14th Amendment. It established a class of citizen that the freed slaves can come into, as well as the conquered southern states, into U.S. citizen status. Now, the key about the 14th Amendment is very central to the whole discussion, which is that there is also a line where I launched off in discussing limited liability by saying that it starts by saying all persons who are born into or naturalized into the United States. Remember, the United States is what now is a corporation, okay, not California as a sovereign republic. So born or naturalized into the United States, a federal U.S. citizen. All persons, corporations under limited liability. All persons, blah, 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 into the United States are afforded, equal protection of the law, et cetera, et cetera. That's a privilege. If you accept U.S. citizen status, you are accepting protection of the law. But what law is it? It's a corporate law. It's West Publishing, private copyrighted law, codes and statutes. So it's a uniform commercial code and every other code. California has 29 sets of codes, and they all attach. So we have the protection, equal protection of the law, but that law is going to be basically a fusion of law when they want to use it to apply, but primarily equity and admiralty, the law of the sea and the law of the contract. Why? Because we've entered into many, many contracts that bind us to the United States and all the obligations and burdens of that. Starting with the other point in the 14th Amendment that says no person or no citizen has the right to challenge the validity of the national debt. That makes equal to citizenship in the federal United States. It means equal to that is the inviolate, unchallengeable nature of the debt. So this is where we get attached to a bonded contract and the inability to challenge the debt. Okay.
So it doesn't matter who is actually basically in power coming into.
No, they're Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Okay.
Oh my God.
Right. So.
And this is all done through fraud, which we call
Right.
tacit agreement and adhesion contract.
Right. So if we act on these contracts without timely objecting and or putting on the record in one form or another, then we're presumed to have assented or agreed to these contracts. Okay. But underlying it ultimately is what Paul just said, that it's all based on fraud. Why? Because it's lack of full disclosure and lack of meeting of the minds, which are two essential components of a valid contract. So, and there's 300 million of us and only a few thousand of them. But it's not going to take 300 million to shift it. We're in the process of that. But of course, like I said earlier, the more we stand in law, the more they're getting more lawless and all the rest of that. But the key is that they are irrevocably, they meaning an agent or an officer of the corporation. They are irrevocably, uncontestably, and unequivocally bound by the limitations and the requirements of their codes and statutes. So the thing is that there are roughly, people estimate 60 million codes and statutes in the corporate United States. None of them apply to us if we sever the presumption and the relationship of those contracts. Okay, we'll get
being the real person.
Yeah, the real living man or the real living woman. So we'll get to that a little later. But laying the structure and the framework, and keep in mind that this is the sort of the crescendo of the bringing together of everything we've talked about, because the United States is the third piece in the tripartite triple crown of the three states, controlling the three bodies, the physical, emotional, and mental, through the canon law, kingdom law, and commercial law. Commercial, going back to Roman law, Roman civil law, and what's called the lex mercantilius, or the law of the merchant. Okay. It can be used against us, as admiralty can be used against us, but if you understand it, it can be used for us. And again, we don't have time or scope to go into that in detail. Yeah, it works both ways. And what we are doing now is perfecting more and more how to use this entire system to our advantage. And they don't like it whatsoever, and it's starting to really shake all of this apart. So this is what happened in 1868, creating that class of citizen, U.S. citizen, side by side with the inviolate, unchallengeable nature of the debt, so that they could create that eternal, everlasting debt slavery and the lord of the manor of the banks binding us by contract and otherwise to that inviolate debt.
Can I just ask you a question? If you're not a citizen of the United States, because I'm a holder of a green card,
Yeah.
and I, of course, I did swear on the Bible in the embassy to obey, of course, the laws of the United States. I did.
Right.
To get the green card.
So when you swear, you gave an oth
I did.
to the
Okay.
jurisdiction, so
Right.
you're as equally bound to it.
So
Now,
yeah.
now a resident,
Yeah, I'm a. Yeah.
okay, in law, definition of words is everything. Res, R-E-S, is a Latin word which means literally it would translate as the object of the thing. Okay, in law it's called in rem jurisdiction versus in personam. In personam means on your person, in res means on objects, or in rem, the object of the thing. Res, identity. So your identity, when you say you're a resident, is an object as chattel property within that jurisdiction that you bound yourself to.
So when I give my green card back and I would leave the country, I have a social security number. How can I claim the money? What's under that social security number? That's what I want to know.
Okay. Well,
Because
you're not going to find that out today because we don't
Right.
have time to go down to that.
I'm just curious because
yeah.
then I actually would no longer. I mean, I can revoke it. Is that not true?
Yeah, but you can also step into, if you desire, into the Republic for the United States of America that the people on the land have re-inhabited and reestablished and become a true
Yes.
living being who can stay here without being a resident in the United States.
Okay.
Okay.
And you will tell us how to do that.
Yeah, but not
Obviously,
to.
I've done that.
Yeah. Paul is not a native-born American, but he has claimed his right and capacity to be in the sovereign de jure jurisdiction of the Republic.
Okay.
Okay. So that's 1868, 14th Amendment. Then we move to 1871, and there's an act passed by Congress. Now, this is not the Constitutional Congress anymore in 1871. It is the corporation, or soon to be the corporation. Because when the Civil War started, what happened? The South, the senators of the South, walked out of the Senate. When they did that, the constitutional body was disbanded. And then they all went to war. And the federal entity, what's the word? They won. And so the South became conquered nations. They were brought in a subjugated status under the Reconstruction Acts. And so when Congress was re-established, it was no longer a de jure lawful body, not a constitutional body. It was a what's called de facto, which means of fact, but standing in unless or until a de jure lawful body reconvened. So they had to establish a basis for them operating, so they passed an act in February of 1871 called the Act for the Incorporation of District of Columbia. And District of Columbia, which had previously been called the City of Washington, was converted to a district as a municipal corporation. It was called Columbia. Why? Because that attaches to the Columba name, which is Latin, as I told you, for dove and Dovid in the line of David. So Washington, D.C. was birthed now as a municipal corporation, and the United States as the operating de facto. Oh, should I not be doing that? So, am I okay? De facto government now stepped into that corporation and began to operate and exist as a corporation, attached to ultimately the Crown and the City of London, and continuing the interests of the British East Indies Company as a commercial extension of the Crown. And it went on from there. Then 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. Another amendment was passed to remove the voting or the placing of senators, which was previously done by the legislatures of each state, was now under democratic principles and elected by the people. Because if you can turn the people into the sheeple and propagandize them and manipulate them through now our modern media and technology, where the Supreme Court last year said that because an artificial person, a corporation, should be afforded equal protection under the law, under the 14th Amendment, now corporations are co-equal with our status, and so they have the right to free speech. So they can spend unlimited money now in influencing the sheeple and the propagandized, mind-controlled population into voting democratically for whomever they're going to be told to vote for. Okay? Because the people can't think anymore. They have no ability to think. They've been dumbed down, as you know. So the other thing that started happening in the 1890s was the infiltration from a lot of very specific people. Who were those people? They were part of those 13 families under the Sabbatean Trust, such as the Kuhns, the Lows, the Warburgs, and so forth, who started infiltrating from Germany, basically, to fulfill Otto the Great's part of the bargain to take over.
They did this consciously. They were consciously aware.
Absolutely, they were planning this and organizing this for hundreds of years. It was, you know, they came out with the Protocols of Zion in the late 1800s. The Zionist movement was established in the 1800s. I mean, the late 1800s, like 1890. The first Zionist Congress was 1896. Okay, organized by the House of Rothschild, to organize all of this for the return to that principle that I said earlier or yesterday was to bringing the two pillars together in that place of Israel, the solar, lunar, stellar cult under the cult of Atan, at that base at the 33 degree crossing point, which energetically and spherically on the globe has powers and principles, also being the end point of that split in the root chakra and the rift of Africa, as I talked about yesterday, energetically. It's all outpicturing of who we are. If you want to know who you are, we are collectively, look at the state of this world. We have created it. We are split and fragmented, and our root chakras have a big rift in it, and we're schizophrenic and we're polarized, and we have accepted and allowed everything. Okay, that's the bad news in a sense, but the good news is if we created it, we can uncreate it and recreate it the way we want it, which is where the spiritual aspect of the inner work is going to come into play. Because at this point, we have to deal with ourselves, you know, and stop projecting outside of ourselves that there's an outside enemy, you know, and we will get to that in a little bit.
Multidimensional spiritual solution.
Right, exactly.
Ken, just a word on how we've been governed. I mean, the emergency war powers.
We are, okay, yeah. But let me finish this about Zionism. So in the 1890s, the first Congress of the Zionist movement was established, and they laid out exactly what they were going to do in keeping with and in alignment with the 3 world wars scenario set out by Albert Pike, and how the World War II would achieve the ability to move and establish the state of Israel. I mean, that was set in place out of World War I, something called the Balfour Declaration, which established the right to reestablish the state of Israel. It was all established or pushed by the House of Rothschild and them fulfilling through the 13 families the Sabbatean mandate. So, among other things, then in the 1890s, you have the infiltration of what was the foundation of the modern, so-called modern United States education system. You know, mandatory public education, you know, which was going to truncate the capacity to think and dumb us down. You know, if you want to give yourself a little test, do a Google on 1890s 8th grade graduation exam,
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
No, but I can imagine.
Okay.
I can imagine.
Well, it's online, and you just do a Google search. 1890 or 1890s 8th grade graduation exam. Remember how we grew up hearing the thing, the phrase, "Oh, he only has an 8th grade education"? That's because if you got through 8th grade in the 1800s, you were quite well educated. That exam is only 2 pages, and as educated as I am, I would probably have failed it because it goes into extensive detail of how law and social governance and civics and all kinds of things were structured, and people were very well educated with an 8th grade education.
Well,
Way more.
The belief that a 12-year-old could actually have the capacity to understand that.
Well, yeah.
It's different now. We baby our children. And
Well, yeah, and that's, it's social educational engineering. Well, it came in as a purposeful construct in the 1890s as an import from Germany, okay? Design of how to break down the mind or the capacity to really think. Children are not taught how to think. They're taught how to do things by rote to get the bennies of trying to be on the top end of the bell curve so that they can climb up the corporate ladder and get the higher bennies, okay? And be good corporate tax-paying citizens.
Now, I don't know if this is something that someone for the good is doing, but in the California educational system, I think it's across the country. I have some relatives that are teachers in that system, and they're about to change the way we do exit exams for high school students now, which is kind of that, what you're talking about, where forever it's been multiple choice questions. They're now going to be essay written questions. The teachers are in panic mode.
Yeah, because they know most people can't pass it. But it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on, when you got walked over by a chainsaw,
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we can't start where we're at and start re-educating. That's part of the agenda of the Republic, is to start building real education. All this knowledge that I have that it took me 40 years to build, we can put into educational models that a 10-year-old can be as knowledgeable about all this as I am, okay? It's not that hard to do, but you have to get the kids out of the, corporate model education system, and et cetera. So anyways, that's the 1890s. So infiltration of media and education and et cetera, leading up to the end of World War II. As far as that goes, there's something called Operation Paperclip. Paperclip. Cute name, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, what it was is that the CIA, which was known as the OSS during the war, had all kinds of agents and spies and so forth in Germany, having identified all of the top-end scientists, German scientists, social propagandists, rocket scientists, engineers, medical scientists, Werner von Braun, Joseph Mengele. Joseph Mengele, the doctor of death in the death camps, was brought over. He died in somewhere in the United States in the 1970s. He was here for 25 years after the war, implementing all of his knowledge and everything from MK Ultra, mind control technology, to bringing in all of the biochemists to bring in the pharmaceutical companies, Merck and Pfizer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's estimated 50,000 Germans brought from the war and infiltrated into everything: military, intelligence, science, industry, media, and so forth.
Including South America.
Well, yeah, a lot went to South America, of course. Absolutely.
Yes.
It's called the rat line.
The what line?
Oh, yeah.
The rat line.
So, I just know a couple who went to.
So there's a phrase that emerged out of World War II and then into the 50s and 60s from the post-Nazi, continuing Nazi regime, which was basically the Fourth Reich. You know, the First Reich was established by Otto the Great in 962 when he established that relationship that I talked about. That ended in 1806, starting the Second Reich that reached its pinnacle when Germany was unified in, what, the 1870s? Under the Kaiser, the Caesar. Okay, that was the Second Reich. Of course, we know that Hitler established the Third Reich in his reign. The Fourth Reich was always intended to be established in the United States. And there's a phrase called, you know, we shall build the 1,000-year Reich on the ashes and destruction of the United States. That's what you're observing today and in the last 10 years, is leveraging off of the United States, starting with the infiltration of all these systems that I talked about, from the Warburgs and the Kuhns and the Lopes to take over Wall Street, take over the money machine, establish the Federal Reserve System, create the Federal Reserve Note to be linked to the Uniform Commercial Code and bonded and underwritten by the Social Security Act, which I'm going to get to all that in a minute, and use it to expand this great paper machine called the Federal Reserve Note to take over the world commercially, while politically, pharmaceutically, medically, etc., basically put in, you know, the system that we are now living in. And so concurrent with that taking place in the 50s into the 60s was something in 1962 engaged or enacted in Madrid, Spain, called the, actually I don't remember what it was called, but it became the Maastricht Treaty. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Maastricht? Okay, which is the basis of the European Union. So in 1962, they established the foundation of how they were going to build the European Union, led basically by Nazi Germany, you know, in its new, more friendlier version. And there was a purpose for creating East and West, East Berlin, West Berlin, East Germany, West Germany, because it was always intended to bring it back together and unify Germany to, you know, make Germany look like a friendlier, nicer Germany post-war, but it was only basically now a controlled corporate subdivision of the United States under the city, the same as Japan was, and then unify Germany back, and then take the best of East Germany and its fascist totalitarianism and West Germany and its democratic capitalism, and unify that on top of the Maastricht Treaty, which was the basis of creating the European Union and the Euro. Right, exactly. So this goes back to the 1921 creation of the Trilateral Commission. Trilateral means if we had the map, you could see Asia as one lateral, Europe, Africa as another lateral, and North and South America as another lateral. That's where the trilateral. So you have everything from NAFTA and CAFTA. CAFTA is the Central American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, trying to create that one lateral under the United States, the Amero, and et cetera, and then the European Union, and then the Asian Union.
So this was all set up, it's basically just the map.
This was all planned hundreds of years ago. Okay.
I'm just absolutely floored.
Hmm?
I totally takes my breath away.
Yeah.
It does,
It just
doesn't
makes
it?
so much sense that people are sidetracked with
Right.
the puzzle pieces
Mhm.
versus the
Well,
overall story.
if you read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, it will read like a textbook history of the last 100 years. We shall do this, we shall do this, we shall do this. It's exactly what has happened. Okay, and you know, and they vehemently deny it. No, we're not doing that. But that is exactly what they did do. You know,
Well,
you know,
and with
and
children, we
Right.
listen to our parents and say, okay.
Right, and
you know.
there's something of the human neurological system called cognitive dissonance. Okay, it's when your brain goes tilt. Okay, it's like when you look at Dick Cheney on the TV saying, "We're from the government, we're here to help." Everything you know says that he's lying, but he looks so sincere. Or Barack Obama, or Bush, they lie with impunity. For one, because they take the oath of Kol Nidra that they can lie all the time, and they've bonded themselves, you know, for example, to the Skull and Bones Society.
Are they kind of like this Manchurian candidate?
Well,
type
they all
of
are. Well, that's who
people?
Obama
That's
is,
just
for sure.
Because how else can they?
You're familiar with you've heard the term, or the Skull and Bones?
Yeah.
Okay, which John Kerry and George Jr. came from against each other, but they took very, very deep and wide oaths. The Skull and Bones, first of all, where does the Skull and Bones come from? It comes from the pirates, right? And who were the pirates? You know, John Morgan and so forth. They operated. There were your lower end kind of pirates who were just rabble rousing. But then there was highly qualified individuals like John Morgan and some of the other very well known ones who were given what's called letters of marque, marque and reprisal. This comes into the Admiralty Law of conquering of war. If you read the Constitution, it says that Congress has the authority to issue letters of marque and reprisal. Okay, a letter of marque authorizes a captain of a ship to take over the vessel of an enemy ship. In other words, if the British are fighting the Spanish, a British captain under a letter of marque from the sovereign, the king, can even though those two vessels are not at war with each other per se, they're commercial or civilian, under a letter of marque, the captain can take over the ship of an enemy ship, okay, if it's flying the flag of an enemy, of his sovereign who issued that letter of marque. This is also very important to understand. Why? Because I'll get to a little bit later how when the corporation went into bankruptcy and everything was brought under it as a sub-corporation, including, you've all heard of the straw man, right? The straw man created a vessel in commerce, okay, to float on the sea of commerce. Okay, what's a vessel? A vessel is a ship. Who was our enemy? The enemy, or constituted or constructed to be the enemy? The corporation. We are actually enemies of the state. I'll get to that in a moment. So the attorney, as a foreign agent, is acting in effect under a letter of marque to board our vessel in the ship of the Temple of Justice, overseen by the magician called a magistrate. That's where the word magistrate comes from. The guy in the black robe is a magistrate. He's a black magician. Okay, so the courtroom is established like the helm of a ship, and he sits there as a magician. The bar attorney comes in, both bar attorneys, defendant and plaintiff, or prosecutor and defendant's representation, they are representing the vessel, the corporation vessel, which is your straw man floating on the sea of commerce. But they are together agents of the Temple Bar and Inns of Court in the City of London, operating under letters of marque where they can board your vessel as an enemy combatant, as a belligerent, to take booty and keep part of the prize, deliver it to their master and keep part of it for themselves. So this is legal rape and pillage under the laws of Admiralty. Does that make sense now?
Yes, so and it does connect to the bones and stuff.
Does everyone know what the straw man is?
Okay, well, I'll get to that in a minute.
I saw some blank faces.
Okay, I'll get to that in a minute. Now, I'm going very fast through a lot of stuff, and I realize after the last day and a half, remember what I said yesterday, if you don't walk out of here reeling and dazed and confused, then I haven't done my job. So have I done my job? Okay, so, once we produce the DVD, you will all be given a copy, and you can watch this over and over and start building. This is a framework to build your education, okay? Now, speaking of DVD, remember that DVD that we,
Yes.
the Davidic line?
Yes.
Well, let me tell you something. Under the implementation of the intent to build the Fourth Reich, the 1,000-year Reich on the ashes of the United States, and the Maastricht Treaty and the European Union and so forth, the placement of the banking, financial, industrial interests of the Nazi regime was primarily placed in this organization, and I can't pronounce it. I'd have to pull it up here, and then I'll do that later. And then Barbara can read it for us. I do have it somewhere on my laptop, but it's something to the effect of Dienst, D-I-E-N-S-T, that's the right word. What does Dienst mean? D-I-E-N.
Dienst means be in service.
Okay, Dienst, and some long German word, it starts with V. I can't even come close to remembering what it is, but Dienst, okay, Dienst means in service. Winter, Winterbaum. So we'll get Barbara, I'll find it, she can translate it later. Deutsche, okay. DVD, that's where the financial, banking, industrial complex of the Nazi regime came under in Munich, Germany, post-World War II, to maintain that financial, banking, industrial complex and bring it into the European Union. What was it? DVD, the artificial political organization of the Davidic line. Then we have the Merovingians with the Davidic line, as I described yesterday, coming into ultimately one of those two pillars under Germanic, structure, as I've described, under the DVD. So there's where the DVD shows up once again, along with the fact that what have we all been doing for the last 10, 15 years? Every time we put in a movie to watch at home, there's those letters, DVD, just inputting into our brain, going, yeah, DVD, DVD.
Subliminal thing.
Yeah, subliminal. Yeah, another inducing of that, that we are consenting and agreeing, just like the two pillars are everywhere you go,
Just reinforcing
Right.
the plan.
Right. Another way to have your decoder ring. In fact, on the TV that my wife and I inherited from a friend a few years ago was an older version from the 1990s. The letters DVD never go away on the TV. It's there 24, not even when you're not watching a movie, it's DVD up in the corner, Now, I have my decoder ring, so I recognize that, and I say, I don't accept and allow the DVD, but how many tens, hundreds of millions of people, especially children, who have been dumbed down to the level they have every day watching, Barney the dinosaur, the purple dinosaur,
Right into their subconscious.
Right.
Okay, so what about the currency? Does it tie into the currency, what you wanted to say before?
Of course. So, the Federal Reserve Act was established in 1913. Okay, remember the northern half of the British East Indies Company is established in the Empire State. And then we have the raising of the obelisk, the artificial phallus of Osiris, the Empire State Building, dedicated as the Maypole on May 1st. I think that was done somewhere in the 1930s. We have 1913, the Federal Reserve Act, creating 12 Federal Reserve banks. That constellation of 12 again, or the zodiac of 12. Okay, also creating 10 districts, that decad, that decimation, breaking down into tens, the 10 districts of the zip code. Okay, Now we think that the zip code is a nice thing. I used to think when I was a kid, zip code means zippy, means it goes fast, right? ZIP stands for Zone Improvement Plan, okay, referring to the Panama Canal Zone, which became a proper United States territory when Panama was broken off, separated from Colombia. It used to be all part of Colombia, and they created Panama about 103 years ago, or 106 years ago, I think 1904. And then when they did that, they gave them the right to finish the Panama Canal. So they created the Panama Canal Zone, and that became a proper, under the Constitution, United States territory. So then they implemented 10 districts called the Zone Improvement Plan districts. That's where the zip code comes from. So this is how they're going to turn it upside down and attach everybody as corporate subdivisions, as vessels in commerce, to the federal zone. And the first thing that was required is take that municipal corporation, District of Columbia / United States, Inc., and put it into a commercial relationship with this central bank of issue called the Federal Reserve. Now the relationship was very simple. Federal Reserve issued Federal Reserve notes, which were interbank notes that the United States accepted as commercial paper to expand the money supply and distribute in, in banking and commerce. What they pledged was the gold that the United States held. Long story made short, they expanded the bubble, the 1920s. Remember the roaring 20s? Everybody was jitterbugging and having a blast. And they also introduced the G-men, to fight prohibition. As David Icke has brought out, problem, reaction, solution. Okay, we've created prohibition. Now we have the mob and, all the bootleggers and stuff. Now we have to build up the FBI to fight that. Then when we're done creating that, we'll get rid of the prohibition. And conveniently, when the United States was in prohibition, Canada was out of prohibition. When United States was out of prohibition, Canada was in prohibition. They did it on both sides of the fence. And so the Roaring Twenties expanded the money supply, and then they collapsed it. And that was the crash of '29, leading up to 1933. FDR took office in 1933, March 6th, and he redeclared something called the War Powers Act, which Paul wanted me to mention. So let's go back to 1860-61. Because constitutionally the president does not have the authority to declare war, that was a congressional power under Article 1, but Congress walked out, remember, so there's no constitutional body. So they did a false flag event, Fort Sumter, and said that the South fired on the North, where in actual fact the North fired on the fort, the South defended itself, they said, they fired on us, we'll declare war. But there was no constitutional body authorized to declare war, so Lincoln he just took upon himself emergency war powers. And by doing that, he put the United States into martial law. And martial law has stayed in place ever since then, although under technical rules, it went out of martial law into what's called martial rule, which means under martial authority ever since then, but not overt, military in the streets martial law until recently. I'll get to that in a minute. So the presidential war powers was established by Lincoln. In 1917, the other key thing was that, the United States was not at war. Europe was at war, fulfilling Albert Pike's recipe for World War I, and they needed the United States to go into war. So, of course, another false flag, they sunk the Lusitania and got the United States into the war. When that happened in 1917, Congress passed something called the Trading with the Enemy Act. And in that, they established who was an enemy, who was not, and who needed to be licensed to operate potentially in adherence to the Trading with the Enemy Act. And one of the things in that act was that it said that what the definition of the enemy was excluded a U.S. citizen. Now remember who a U.S. citizen was. It was a 14th Amendment U.S. citizen. In 1933, when FDR took office, and if you did a Google search on FDR's first inauguration speech, you will see him saying, I am going to ask Congress to give me the war powers to fight this war against this economic enemy. And that was March 6th. March 9th, he declared an emergency and took upon himself the emergency war powers that have stayed in place ever since then. So there has been a declared state of war, first with that declaration of war against the economic necessities, and ever since, war on poverty, war on drugs. Now with 2001, 9/11, what did George Bush do? He said, we're declaring war on terrorism, which established, and then Cheney came out and said, we're going to be fighting this war for the entirety of all of your lifetimes. In other words, a state of perpetual war, fulfilling George Orwell's state of war. You know, training the population that war is good, war is peace, all the rest of it. And then defining in the Patriot Act the nature of a belligerent and an enemy combatant. Now what they do, what they have that's part of the Patriot Act and otherwise, is and then now they're getting it out through the media into the population psyche, paper terrorism. So that all of us who are using pieces of paper to actually require them to follow the law, their codes and statutes, can be characterized as paper terrorists. And they do use that, but they're also becoming more afraid of our knowledge and capacity to enforce the law. And if I hear the term paper terrorism, I just laugh at it and step right over it. I said, fine, you come after my paper and I will give you lots more of it, you know. But you can hear in how I talk, and if people who are knowledgeable enough when they're speaking for the Republic, I often will say, we are neutral, peaceful, and non-belligerent. Okay, and that's very important because in international law, there was a treaty signed in 1899 at The Hague amongst many nations that established the definition and the law of a belligerent. Okay, and so in 1933, when FDR declared a state of emergency and a state of war, he suspended, initiated a bank holiday, and among other things, Congress passed an amendment to the Trading with the Enemy Act. And the amendment said that it amended the definition of the enemy. And it's right there in that amendment, and basically it changed it from excluding citizens of the United States from enemy definition to including citizens. So they literally declared war against the U.S. citizen as an enemy combatant or a belligerent. So,
You're not protected.
Pardon?
You're not protected then as a U.S.
You're an enemy.
You're an enemy, okay. For as long as you allow the presumption to identify you with equal to being a U.S. citizen, and that gets into what a straw man is and all of that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But let that sink in. The United States as a foreign power under the authority of the British East Indies Company as a commercial instrumentality of the Crown and the City of London and the Vatican in its own congressional act declared the United States citizen as an enemy. Okay?
And nobody in this country stood up and noticed that and said, oh my God.
No, they were, okay, this is the definition of the New Deal. Here's the New Deal. We are going to give you what FDR promised. What did he promise? A chicken in every pot. Okay? I'll take my chicken, And my characterization as a U.S. citizen, enemy of the state, under the law of belligerency, passed in that treaty of 1899. It's called a declaration of mixed war. Mixed war meaning it operates in many levels. It doesn't necessarily mean shooting. It means paper war, congressional acts war, declarations of trading with the enemy act, etc., etc. Okay, so that's actually the state of what has existed since 1933 on. Now, if we were to go through all the pieces of the building blocks of building towards where we're at today, it would take us months, weeks, years, you know. But I'm giving you a basis, a foundation from which you can understand how this has all been put together. And again, it's all to go to that very simple structural construction of the two lines of the king and the priest to lift us off the land, put us in the containment field. Because what happened from post-1933 on, the other thing is the United States as a corporation went into bankruptcy, okay, when he declared all of this and established it in March of 1933. Then on April 5th, 1933, a proclamation was put out saying that all persons, remember that's a U.S. person, U.S. corporation, if somebody was knowledgeable in the law, he could say, I'm not a U.S. person, I'm going to keep my gold. But they all didn't know that. They were dumbed down to that level. You know, so when you say, why didn't they object? Some did. There were some senators and so forth who objected. You know what happened to them? Most of them got thrown out of 30th floor windows, you know. There were numerous senators who fought it, who got murdered and suicided.
It was during a time where that, yeah, a lot of people.
Well, then there was no, you know, forensic analysis and so forth, and you know, it's like, hey, just, you know, what
So
I forget.
That was April 5th?
Okay, okay, so April 5th.
Because April 7th, Prohibition was.
It was June the 5th, 1950.
No, but there's April 5th first. April 5th, the declaration, proclamation, whatever it was called by FDR, saying that all persons in the United States under threat of a $10,000 fine, and that was a lot of money back then, must bring all of their gold into a Federal Reserve Bank. Guess what date?
May 1st.
Exactly. On May 1st, bring all their gold and exchange it for Federal Reserve notes. That under the emergency new banking laws and so forth were now to be legal tender.
But
Okay.
wasn't that when the League of Nations in 1933 was going into the United Nations? And
Well, what was happening then was,
Yeah, see, there's a thrilling circus going on right at
there's a
that
lot
Yeah.
of things happening right
well,
now.
there's another statement that FDR made in a public speech once that I am fond of quoting. He quoted, or he stated, nothing in history happens by accident. So that's why I'm saying this has been planned for hundreds and hundreds of years, you know.
And interesting, the timeline, I happen to know that because it's my father's birthday, is April 7th, 1933.
Is when Prohibition. Okay,
Right.
see, I knew it was somewhere around
And
there.
it's
So,
2 days later.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what a nice.
you know, all these things were being put in place. So April 5th, that went out. May 1st, they had to exchange substance, constitutional money, gold, for, they didn't take the silver out then, but silver was demonetized. It wasn't considered. See, the original, people talk about a gold standard, but the original structure established in 1792 with the 1792 Coinage Act, which set up the mints and so forth, established a specific weight and measure between gold and silver and a ratio. It said that silver was a dollar of silver was to be 371.25 grains of pure silver. That's how much was in a silver dollar, or a dollar of silver. And the proper phrasing is a dollar of silver. It's a weight and measure, okay, like a quart of milk. And then when you take all of the silver out, it's like an empty quart container with no milk in it. There's no substance, no nourishment, okay? So the relationship was $1 of silver at that weight to 15, the same weight of gold was equal to $15. Later they changed it to $20, so it was a 20-to-1 ratio. But in the 1870s and all the stuff that was going on, as I've described, they pushed through demonetizing silver. Why did they do that? Because when gold was the only monetary accepted unit of measure, what?
Oh, okay.
Okay. I mean, lawful specie, coin of the realm, then they could play with the variables with the banking system in the 1870s through the early 1900s with paper against gold. And there's a book called The Coming Battle that describes all of that. It's online, it's available. It goes through the whole history of the 1800s in the battle relative to the monetization of gold, silver, and then taking silver out. So when they took gold out, there was no lawful money. There was circulating coin in your pockets. They took that out in 1966, which I'll get to why that happened then in a minute.
They had certificates too, right? Didn't they have the-
Well, yeah, there were silver certificates, which were demand against silver.
1966.
Yeah, and there were coins and dollars and half dollars and all of that. But they took the gold out because the United States had to pay off its obligation, so they gathered all the gold to the Federal Reserve as part of the reorganization plan. Okay, because the United States from that point forward is going to be the debtor in reorganization and debtor in possession, possessing its assets. But part of the reorganization plan is that you have to bring more collateral, and we're going to monetize that collateral and turn it into negotiable instruments, commercial paper that can be exchanged because we've now taken all the money out, the real money, gold. Okay, and then on June 5th, there was something called the House Joint Resolution 192, which established that because we've taken lawful money out of the system, that means you cannot denominate payment of contract in gold. It is now illegal to do that. So in order to replace that, because it was required to be replaced, that they had to give us a remedy. Okay, because now we no longer have constitutional lawful money.
Right.
And at the same time, they're going to take all of the people and all of the property and all the collateral and bring it in to monetize it under the Federal Reserve System. As I said, between the Uniform Commercial Code, the Federal Reserve Legal Tender System, and the Social Security Act. That's the three-way nexus point of the law of the priest from that point forward. So they lifted us off the land starting actually in the 1870s. That's when they instituted equity insurance, title insurance. And they were taking us away from holding land to only having equity, And eventually they would take all the equity out too, as we've observed recently. And that's a whole nother story that we don't have time for. But they passed new banking acts. They created what was called the Securities Exchange, the Securities Exchange Act, Securities Exchange Commission. Why the Securities Exchange? Because then they were going to create everything as a security. So there's either bonds or equity shares and various forms of commercial paper, all under the rules of the Uniform Commercial Code. It's all a sea of paper.
Smoke and mirrors.
And then it's all going to be, so then they created a birth certificate. Well, before I go into that, remember we're enemies at this point. When you are under conquest, a martial authority can allow the civilian population to do certain things under authorization from that martial authority. In order to gain that authorization, you have to get either a license, registration of something, or a certification. What do we have everywhere? Licensing, registering, certifying, certification.
And it is a privilege, they make it
Right.
very clear
So
that you
it's
have
a
it.
license or a certification or a registration that they can take away if you go out of the rules. What does that sound like? It sounds like following the law of the priest in the temple, and if you don't follow it, if you become a heretic, you are excommunicated. Your ability to operate is removed. Your privilege under civil rights is removed. He who giveth can taketh away, you know. So we gave up our substantive unalienable rights for civil privileges and allowed ourselves to be licensed, registered, and, you know, now a baby is born, the baby is given a birth certificate to create the vessel in commerce. He or she is given a hepatitis B shot to start degrading the immunity of the physiology and the genetics. And he becomes another piece of inventory in this whole system of collateral registration.
This is sure different than what they taught me in high school.
Okay, so now, I would like my power back, to make it simple. I would like to do this, and I want to know how. Tell me. How am I going to do this? We have to unite. I want to know. We have to unite, really, truly.
Well,
There
we
has
are
to be
doing
a
that. There's
system,
lots of
you know.
us doing that.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll get to that later.